You are listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. This episode is a highlight clip from this week's full episode. To listen in on the complete conversation, see the show notes for the link to the complete show. You can help us out by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate every bit of your support. I'm Morgan McKittrick, your producer, and this is Decidedly.
It's interesting because all of the training that you're talking about going through are around sort of forming up a mechanism to essentially, I would think, create rules that are governing future behavior, really taking out the uncertainty of the decision-making process. In fact, sort of trying to remove the decision-making process. But it would seem, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, it would seem that once you're deployed, those situations are so highly charged, so different, so in some cases chaotic, that it would be very difficult to actually create rules around decision making. And so that's where my interest lies, is how do you form up a group that is as successful as the SEALs to make this, to actually try and remove decision making, and then have people who have to make these life and death literally decisions all the time.
Yeah, so it's again, it's the training, and you're preparing for every possible contingency, every possible outcome, but you develop what are called standard operating procedures. And the good thing about the SEAL teams is they allow everyone to be a leader, to everyone to think. Like I'll give you an example during the SWAT type training or the CQB, when you're going through a building and you've got a stack of guys, 10, 15, 20 people. They all know what to do when they encounter whatever the problem is, that's coming up. And some guys have to pull off into a room, and that may have been the top leader in the platoon. Well, the next guy already knows and has to stand up and knows those standard operating procedures. And I think that's a huge part of it, is to minimize all of those possibilities. But, and the SEAL teams are great because they kind of you don't have to be sick to get better. We're always trying to question, always trying, we're learning stuff. We're also trying to question, okay, why are we doing this? Is this outdated? Is there new stuff that plays into this? So I think, again, it tactically with decision making, there's a lot of things. I mean, with leadership, if guys are asking you about career advice or, how to lead somebody, so to speak, or what should they do in a situation. Well, the good thing is you allow these people to be able to speak, and to kind of come to these conclusions and kind of check them. It's and also to take other people's ideas into consideration. Beforehand. Obviously, when you get into a combat situation, it's kind of you're on kind of fire and forget. And SEALs are really good. I'll tell you one thing that I think you're asking me about what separates some guys. I think the ability to compartmentalize and disassociate in chunk. So like with, like learning new skills, like a guitar, you don't just sit down and play the entire song. You have to chunk pieces of that and different things. Well, in SEAL training, in BUDS, it sucks so bad. It's like, oh my God, I just need to get through this run. This run is the only thing I need to worry about. And then after that, the same thing. Well, we do that also in combat. We've got we've got these points of where we're going, and we know these phase lines, and we know that we just need to do our job. We know what to do in that little moment. We don't think of the overwhelming aspect of what's going on around us in combat. It's just, I know what to do right now and what's right in front of me. And once I get to that next point, I'll be there. So I think that chunk.
Yeah, and I think that goes into broadly speaking, a decision-making process that sticks with you for life, I would imagine. Whether it's resiliency or being able to compartmentalize. I think where you were going, it seems like there are, obviously you can't just put a group of 6 guys out there in the middle of the desert somewhere and expect them to make the right decision at every turn, right? You've got to prepare and train with these standard operating procedures to make sure that they know tactically exactly what to do. But then the gray area has to also be trained, right? That resiliency has to be, that's a decision. There's a decision to quit in training, just like there is in combat or in anything else in life that's hard. You have a decision to quit. And the SEALs, it seems like, have done a better job than any organization that I can think of training that out of people, or finding people that never had it in the first place.
Yep.
But how much of that is conscious? How much of that resiliency are you guys consciously training outside of the official training times and officially at buds? How much of that compartmentalization, that way of thinking, how much of that are you guys consciously focusing on, maybe when you're not wearing the uniform?
Well, before, I don't think in the SEAL teams there has been some mental training that we have done, some visualization, some type of breath work and meditation type stuff, and that's been more recent. And so that's kind of if I have a passion, it's for how to develop resilience and keep on with mental toughness. And I don't think it was a conscious thing ever for me, other than before my third time at Buds. But once I got into the SEAL teams, wars happened. I mean, that was right before September 11th, and I did multiple combat deployments. I had the loss of 18 close friends that were like roommates and groomsmen in the SEAL teams, that died either in combat training or 5 of them by suicide. And that'll your level of, for me, my level of resilience I thought was pretty good, but traumatic brain injury, SEALs were exposed to so many explosives that they didn't know this until recently, that repetitive blasts cause traumatic brain injuries. It's not like in football where somebody gets hit and they get one part of their brain bruised, right, from the counter-coup effect.
Yeah.
And that part is affected, whatever part of the region of the brain that is. With explosives, right, even small ones, not like the breaching that we do to knock down doors, so to speak. I've been exposed to about 400 or 500 explosive blasts in my life, and they didn't find out until a lot of SEALs were killing themselves. And so they did autopsies on their brains, and their family members donated their brains, and they found out that they had this thing called this tearing through every region of the brain that caused this thing called astroglial scarring. And it's so after about 10 years, I remember it. So it took me 10 years. A couple buddies of mine made it through SEAL training, so they were 10 years ahead of me. But I remember going, man, they just seem kind of hollow, and I didn't know what it was. I was just like, they're just, turning into kind of jerks and quiet. But it wasn't until the end of my career, all these explosive blasts, right, as well as the loss. And, I've seen some bad stuff. I worked in the medical field and all that stuff. SEALs have to remind themselves every once in a while that they're human, because sometimes they think that our physiology is completely different than everybody else's. The resilience is, I think my resilience was higher, but that's a lot to ask. And so I remember, God, this is probably about 2014. I remember telling a guy I worked with, I was like, man, I feel like a shell of a man right now. I don't know what it is. I was having sleep issues, and I got put on hormones and, thyroid and testosterone and a bunch of other stuff. And I remember when I was getting ready to retire, and this was a few years, I retired about 2.5 years ago. So it was probably 3.5 years ago. I was doing all my medical appointments and get ready for my VA stuff and disability exams and all that stuff. And traumatic brain injury, most SEALs will tell you, yeah, traumatic brain injury, that's cool, explosives. But when you start talking about PTSD, they're like, nah, that's mental illness, that's mental weakness. That's kind of, it has been, and probably most guys, when they're in, would kind of tell you that. And I had a decision to make, I did. And coming into the kind of the plot of the show, so to speak, I remember I was doing all of these different things for balance. I was doing memory. I was going through speech therapists for memory techniques, and my eyes would bounce as I would walk. So I was doing this vestibular therapy, and I'd lose balance when I was walking in crowded situations. And I remember when I was still in the Navy, but I was applying for my VA appointments for traumatic brain injury. The psychologist asked me, she's like, why aren't you applying for PTSD? I was like, I don't know. I don't think I have it. And she's like, oh, you absolutely have it. And that was a big decision for me at that point. It was that was a big catalyst, but I was like, okay, I got to address this. And so when I went back, and talked to my wife and my daughter, I found out that they'd been walking on eggshells around me for the past 4 or 5 years. I reached out to some friends that have known me for a long time that I interacted with regularly. One of my close friends used to have, my brother was living with me at the time, but my friend John used to have to get a hold of my brother to get a hold of me. And that's just one example. So I was kind of starting to isolate myself. And when I realized I was having this generational impact on my daughter, that my behaviors were affecting her, that I'm like, okay, I decided I've got to do something about this. And I did everything I could in the military. They put me on antidepressants and stimulants, and I went to counseling, and it didn't do a thing. I think it screwed me up more than anything. And so you kind of hear guys talking about stuff, through the rumor mills. And I found out about the first thing I tried was what this is called. It's commonly referred to as transcranial magnetic stimulation. So they put a magnet on your head, and they create these new neural pathways. And you do it over about 6 weeks, about 30 minutes a day. And it helped. It did. It helped my sleep and my mood, but it kind of wore off after a couple months. And I can get to why I think that is that way here in a minute. But it wasn't until I was trying stuff. I started to try to meditate, and I was, that was a big thing. I was reading everything I could. I was proactively engaged in my own help, so to speak. And it wasn't until I heard about a treatment down in Mexico that I was a little skeptical of, but I started doing the research, and it's overwhelmingly supportive. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of psychedelic assisted therapy, Sanger. I'd be surprised if you haven't, because it seems like everybody under 30 knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I'm a little bit familiar. This is like microdosing on psilocybin or no? Okay.
No, definitely not. So so what this is again, went through an entire screening process, went through medical cardiology tests and labs and everything else, and was screened by a psychologist, and went down to Mexico, and it is super, super high doses. Sean, when you and I grew up, kids were probably taking like a gram or two of mushrooms if they ever did that type of stuff. I never did any of that, but so this is it would be like 5 grams, but it wasn't mushrooms. It was these 2 drugs. One is called ibogaine, and it's considered the godfather of psychedelics. It's an old African drug from this tribe out there, the Igwitis, and they use it for kind of a ritual as they grow up. But the interesting thing about ibogaine is they found out that it really has a 90% success rate of curing opiate and heroin addiction. That's huge. Okay. Well, they found out curing it, of being
curing the addiction,
physiologically free, doing blood tests and whatever else they do for that. Literally, there's zero withdrawal. You do this, and it's about 12 hours of feels like you're getting hit with a baseball bat. It's pretty hardcore, and it scares off a lot of SEALs because it's the medicine is one thing, okay, and that's a huge thing, but it's the insights you gain.
Thanks for making the great decision to listen in to this week's episode highlight. If you want more of what you just heard, see the show notes for the full episode. As always, for the latest decision-making tips, find us on decidedlypodcast.com or on Instagram @decidedlypodcast. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter from the link in the show notes. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review as well. We read all of your comments, so if you learned some decision-making tips today, let us know. Until next time, this is Decidedly. Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers who are not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their own opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.